All right, back. Builders Build 8. And this one, we're covering what might sound like a dull topic, but it's actually probably one of the most useful pods we'll ever do, which is sales and operations planning. This basically covers organizational concepts and tools that allow your business to run. And this doesn't matter if you're making a physical good or a software good. Really, it's about sales. How do you plan how much you can sell? Operations, how do you plan how much you can make of what you can sell? And then finance, how do you have the money to cover that? Any other intro notes from you guys? You want to leave with the hard James explains, like just kick it off with that? Or
I think the best part about this is like I'm pretty fucking, excuse my language, but pretty terrible at a lot of this stuff. And so I think that you guys coming from, because working in much bigger orgs, which I think you guys have done a lot more, gives you a lot more experience in the space. So I'm ready to be a sponge. I'm ready
to give some context on this, because I've been in a bunch of businesses that are like different sizes. Like obviously Colin and I worked in this business that has hundreds of SKUs across multiple states where we manufacture them ourselves, we distribute them ourselves. It's probably the most complex S&op process I've ever been a part of, but I think we all loved it. And Colin went complete ninja mode and like made these crazy documents and systems that we followed to do it. But also, I'm like a partner in a small clothing line, and we do our own version of this that kind of changed how we look at how we sell when we actually instituted a plugin and like started planning our inventory and sales, as opposed to being like, we're just going to order this amount. And then a number of other businesses have kind of been in the middle throughout the years who've either done really sophisticated or really terrible jobs at this. And so it's something that any business I feel can benefit from. And let's go.
And just before we dive in, for anybody that's not watching the video, to keep S&op a little bit less dry, we've got James here in a tutu, and then Oren's son is juggling in the background of his video as well. So
Kingston,
yeah,
the fuck you doing?
he was rocking those Elton John sunglasses earlier today, though. So maybe
we let him dress himself this morning. It was a what do the kids say? A movie? All right,
we're making sales and ops planning interesting. Let's 100%.
All right, let's kick into it, because I do feel this is ultra valuable. Let's talk about first. So, how the S&op process typically works is sales presents a forecast. This is sales-driven sales and operations planning, which is, I think, how I recommend 90% of people do their ops. Because if you don't do it like that, if you go capacity-based planning and you say, I have X amount to sell, how are we going to sell it? Then you tend to be making up crazy strategies and ideas and not actually focusing on your business. So we'll focus a lot on, hey, you start with sales. Sales puts out a forecast of what they think they're going to sell. So we're going to talk a bit about how do we get there? What are some strategies of forecasting? How does that all work? Any kind of notes or thoughts before I dive into this more?
Let me articulate a visual on like what we're talking through here. Like Oren said, starting with sales, what comes after sales is inventory in stock, ready to sell. After that, you have your capacity to create or get more inventory, which may be internal if you're manufacturing it, or POs from someone else. And then finally, you have what you need to make said capacity, right? So it's really like, I think of it as those four parts. If you exclude, do we have the cash to support such a thing?
That kind of stuff for software. Go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say, I think that my biggest experience with this is more from like the capital raising side, right? I've looked at thousands and thousands of decks of people raising money, and sort of like understanding there's two parts of this. There's like, you really want your company to function like in a healthy way and sort of understand how to do that. But for a lot of people that are raising money, a lot of this is going to be predicated on like, what are you forecasting? And then are you hitting those KPIs, right? Like, because if you're raising money again and again and again, you tell me you need $1.5 million, I give it to you, and you don't forecast your sales correctly, right? Or any of these revenue numbers, then you're gonna have a hard time raising that money again, right? Because people are gonna be pretty disappointed.
And I would say that that was much more relevant before Stripe partnered with the Mafia for their Loan Shark program, where any e-commerce business based on your sales volume can go and borrow money at 400%. Sign up now.
No problem. Exactly.
Well, it is important to know that there's a difference between, I think a lot of what we're talking about here is going to be forecasting for if you have an existing business, like if you've sold some things and you want to expand it. Forecasting pre-revenue is definitely a complete dark art where you're like, all right, I assume I'm going to do X based on some industry data or some whatever. And decks like that are completely harder. I think we're going to be taking a really practical look at how some of this works. And I'd say like this isn't just about physical goods and the capacity to make them and stuff too. I want to think about software, because you would say, hey, if we're going to be selling more than we expected, do we have enough customer service or customer success reps to maintain onboarding? What's that going to mean for our AWS fees? Is our infrastructure built to be able to handle 1,000 users versus 100 users versus 100,000 users? So even though a lot of this applies to physical goods, there's still a lot of ways to think about it that impact software. You still want to go through some of these same sales and ops processes, even if you're selling courses or software or any of those other things too. So just a quick note there. So we'll kick off with types of forecasting. So the first is I want to talk about is there's bottoms up and top down forecasting. These are common terms that you'll kind of hear in business. And so a top down forecast is basically you look at the market and your industry, and you say, what is the industry growth expected to be in in this kind of time period? And you say, all right, we assume that everything's going to, because of seasonality and how things typically work in the last few months, the industry is going to grow 3 or 5%. There's big data that goes out there. You say, okay, well, we should then grow at an equal amount. That's a really rough way to look at top-down forecasting. This is useful in really big established businesses, but isn't extremely useful in nascent industries or in small businesses. And so that's why I'd like to recommend bottoms-up forecasting. This is a really tactical approach where you go, how many accounts do I have? Whether accounts like a person that buys from you or a retail store that buys your product or a distributor or any of those things. Like, so this is a lot more based like account-based sales, like, software seats, or for, retail sales to stores. And you go, all right, let's actually make a tally of how many of these people have it, how often do they purchase, how often they kind of repeat that, how much do we expect them to expand, are they taking on any new products? And you actually build from your account list a completely up forecast based on kind of realistic numbers. Those are kind of two typical approaches to take, and is kind of a useful concept to know and think about.
And I would just tack onto that when we're talking e-commerce businesses, DTC businesses that are ad driven, right, where a significant portion of revenue is from ad spend, you're 5,000% looking bottoms up, right? Because that something doubling your ad budget on a monthly basis or cutting in half, so on and so forth, is going to directly affect your top line, and all the way through.
Yeah, and I can tell you that sort of from a lot of the stuff I've looked at, referencing what we were saying earlier on, is that like, and I'm sure you guys saw this in the cannabis industry, right? So you obviously have opportunities where you can sort of look at this bottoms up forecasting. That's probably the right way to do it. But half the decks I've seen in my life are, sort of, so to speak, this top down forecasting, right? It's like, this industry is growing, X amount over the next 3 years. We're going to get this amount of it. And sort of that is, it's like sort of like reading tea leaves. You know what I mean? It's sort of just an obscene sort of version of, it's like, a tarot card reading. There's only so much reality to it, right? So it makes a lot of sense to obviously be looking from a bottoms up perspective.
And so I think, and Colin brought up DTC, which I think is a good thing to touch on too, is that DTC, there's two kind of typical ways to look at forecasting that are worth knowing. One is straight line, like a percent growth. And you say, hey, we're going to grow 4% every month over month, and we're going to sell X more. And you kind of plan to do that accordingly. And the other one is a moving average, where you take your trailing 3 to 5 months, and then you add you kind of use what happened there to kind of predict what's going to happen in the next month. And those are both very reasonable metrics. And so you can just kind of decide which way that you want to approach it, and then see if you're actually hitting your forecast or not. That's a big part of the s&op process that we'll kind of dive into at the end, is just reconciling what happened the month prior. Hey, we said we were going to do a 5% growth. We got 3%. And then when you do this month, you say, hey, we said we're going to do 5% again. Should we actually make that 3%? And kind of dealing with some of those, which is like never the fun part of business, but it's always the really realistic things you look at to actually kind of make some progress. And I think that one thing that we were talking about a bit before the pod, I think is really relevant, is this idea of constraint by choice. So for instance, James sells a course where he maxes out the number of seats and says, I'm only going to sell this many. Like there's a hot LA cookie that only sells a certain amount of cookies when they do cookie drops. So you can choose to say, hey, we're not so much doing this based on an increase. We are just knowing we're going to build our entire business around, we sell a set amount of things we know we can always sell. That's a look for our brand. I figured that's an interesting thing to kind of dive more into and look at the ups and downs of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think forget my course, or forget even the last crumb, which is the cookie when you're talking about. I think that
the pod.
there's a, yeah, dude, please sponsor the pod.
Are you enjoying a delicious cookie while listening to this podcast? If so, the last crumb. Yeah.
Dude, they have one called the Donkey Kong. It's this banana cookie. It's so dope, but it's like a $200 box of cookies. Anyway, the Nelk boys, have done like a really the sort of kings of drops like this, right? And so this sort of this idea of like controlling supply. Ironically, what I think people's perception is, when you hear about this, you start thinking like, okay, I'm going to sell less. When I think in actuality, very often there's two things that come from here. First, you actually sell the same amount or more, because you sort of have this limited release. You build this hype. You manage to get all the demand to come in a singular moment in time. And alternatively, the other side of it is that you can forecast really well. I think one of my many, many failed businesses when I was younger was I had a clothing line with an old friend who's now an incredibly successful clothing designer. But I remember, we would have like 6 different t-shirts that came in 3 different colors with 4 different sizes, right? And so like alone right there is 6 times 3 times 4, we're at 72 SKUs. I mean, it's just obscene, right? And so like, how do you sort of
for a little
forecast that?
rinky-dink t-shirt brand?
Yeah, for like a t-shirt company,
It's a
like
nightmare.
that we were like, first we're screen printing on Duane Street in Tribeca, and then we got other people do it. But like, then it gets more complicated when you started going into retail, because certain retailers are taking some on consignment, some are, and even big retail, like we'll make you buy back inventory from certain, you know what I mean, contractually certain times. So it is like it's such an interesting concept, the idea to like sort of have a little bit more control of all of this by sort of making sure that there's a limited release, or that you're building up demand and making sure to get it in one.
It's a brand choice too. Go ahead.
Totally. To that end, I just like wanted to throw in there that like really as a precursor to all this, less SKUs, less SKUs, have less SKUs, don't do more SKUs, have less SKUs, right? And so when James mentions something with sizing, right? If your goal in life is to do a t-shirt brand, then fair enough, you're going to deal with sizes. But I know one place where this has been relevant for us very, very recently is like on promotional merchandise, right? For brands, I always try and steer clear of things with sizes.
Nothing with a size.
Always, every single time, right? Because all of a sudden, your order for to get promo merch to 300 people all of a sudden becomes this calculus about like what is the standard deviation of sizing across this kind of
free game hats over shirts all day.
Yeah, so hats, hats, bags. All kinds of things, anything,
water bottles,
anything but a
notebooks.
shirt.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, by the way, when we were buying in 2021, when I was, looking at brands to buy, and we ended up getting one brand that ended up doing really as 3 SKUs, right? But it's just 3 different products. As it was a little complex. I kept calling it a single SKU brand, but it was not. But the one thing I looked at a lot, there was a lot of for sale that I never wanted to touch, was clothing. Right? Because it's like, forget even the simple t-shirt company. I mean, forget the simple t-shirt company. And actually to this point, Colin and I and Oren have been talking about jeans recently, right? And so I've been buying these Rag & Bone jeans. Rag & Bone only comes in a 32 length now. They do not make a different length of jean anymore.
Yeah, well, you can just hem that shit with whatever you want anyway. If you don't have
unless you're a tall king like me, dog.
I
mean, like that's 32 is like perfect for me. But if I got friends who are 6'3",
bro, you got to take that hem up like at least 2 inches, brother. We're in LA now. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Get an ankle tat. I mean,
yeah, totally. But anyway, shut up. But don't you think that like? I mean, I'm surely part of that comes from like a forecasting and sales perspective, right? Of like understand like, okay, if we add 4 lengths of pant to all 40 different kinds of pants we make in 6 different colors, we have like an extra 1,200 SKUs just for length, right?
It's crazy how it adds up like that. I mean,
well, everyone's unhappy if you don't have their size. Like, oh, you don't have a 3X, like you're not taking into account everyone's body type, or hey, your extra small is different than someone else's extra small, so I'm returning it. It's just it's a nightmare.
Yeah, and so I mean, you probably start out, and so to go back was I didn't want to acquire any companies that were selling clothing at all. It seemed terrifying to me. And then I think what's interesting is you have some of these sort of larger aggregators that like some of their tech, Thrasio, which is buying up all these Amazon FBA brands right now, right? So a lot of Thrasio's value prop in terms of why to invest in them is they have like a really, really good internal proprietary system in which they can sort of do forecasting for understanding inventory management and sort of what's needed. And obviously like en masse, that's a pretty massive thing, because if you've got thousands of SKUs, you have to then start realizing that there's no way you're going to ever sell them out, right? There's when you buy product, it's just, you're going to have
this, especially with clothing, is going to be like is seasonality and trends. And so the clothing brand I work closest with is a women's clothing brand. And it is basically like, all right, we sell skirts all through the spring and summer. We sell jackets all through the summer, through the fall and winter. But like and we continue to sell some of them, or in both, but then it kind of moves accordingly. But then you'll just see a drastic, like, hey, guess what? Denim is fucking done. And so all denim that we're sitting on, like, we've got to figure out, and there's things that work like that. And I think it's something to really care about. And we use this app called Inventory Planner. And I highly recommend this is a super free game alert, that if you are running a Shopify store and you're running an Amazon store and you need an app, it's just inventory-planner.com, I believe. So this is it doesn't take into account the kind of things I just talked about, like the seasonality and trending. And that's the kind of stuff you have to layer. It's why it takes a personal touch and like an executive team to run a sales and operations planning process versus just looking at the app data. But like in that app, it's going to basically give you the breakdown of here's the velocity of what you sold, and here's how it changed. And you could say, all right, we sold 8 of the, we've increased how much we sold, of this one item or this one size perspective. It kind of gives you that dynamic flow across all of your different SKUs, lets you make those decisions. And kudos to making this app, because if it didn't exist, I'd be trying really hard to make it. And I think they did a great job on it. But like that's the kind of stuff you could do. Is there are tools for small businesses that don't involve like full ERPs that just plug into your stores if you are a DTC that help you with that planning.
I mean, one step before this, again, in this genre of e-com and DTC business, I've been really, really shocked recently, as I've kind of been getting more into the e-com space, of how many of these businesses like don't have real inventory tracking in their books, right? Like you don't need to have a, Sage or some full-blown ERP to be tracking your inventory in your accounting software. And James, when my wife was looking for a business, and when I kind of started looking around again, I had this like moment of, whoa, like a lot of these Shopify businesses, and like which a lot of them are hundreds of thousands or not millions of dollars a year, like they don't even know what you're talking about when you would say, is your inventory on your books in your system? So I feel like there's a whole step before, this inventory planner app, which I agree is excellent. The starting point of that is like knowing that you have 98 pieces of that one item, right? And if you don't have that, then you don't get to do any cool apps or spreadsheets to help you plan.
That actually makes me realize we should do a deep dive into like P&Ls and cash flow statements and balance sheets, right? Because that's one thing that I remember looking through people's like doing due diligence on companies, and they were like, "Oh, we have this much inventory on our balance sheet." I was like, "Whoa. How are you valuing that inventory, right? What you paid for it or what you think it's worth, right? Or like what you're going to sell at a retail." And so I remember looking at these things. I was like, "Well, you guys have $3 million in inventory." They're like, "Oh, well, if we sell it, it'll be worth that." I was like, no.
That's not that's not the way it works.
No, but but I think that what happens, and myself included, right? Like unless you have the opportunity to sort of work, there's 3 ways to learn, right? You either go to school, you sort of get the experience, or you get your hands dirty and learn by messing up. And most of my experience has been getting my hands dirty and messing up. And so I think it's if you haven't gone to school for it, which I think a lot of our listeners have not, then you end up in a situation where hopefully you worked in a bigger company and you learned from someone that showed you how it works. So otherwise, you're totally lost on that. And by the way, understanding a balance sheet or a cash flow statement, like that's definitely not something that you just know, right? So like understanding that, I think is I used to get upset by it, and I'm like, oh, no one has just told you that, and someone to teach me all this stuff, right? It's not as if I just
this is why Builders Build exists, is that we're going to give this alpha to the people. I'm literally like, as we start plotting these episodes of what this looks like, I go, what's the stuff that I wish that someone had been able to guide me through or know? And this is one of the biggest ones, because like I learned a lot of this when working at 3DR with Colin, because we had this guy Ivan who was he had been previously at Monster Cable, and he had come in to do it there, and he was just like, you guys don't have a sales and ops planning process? Like, you out of your minds? And then like, really worked through how does that work, and like put all those things together, and everyone was a part of it. And then like from then on, I've like carried that torch into every business I've gone to. And if you don't get those experiences in your life, how are you going to do it? And nowadays, as DTC entrepreneurs or coming in where you may not have a bunch of big business experience, like I may have been lucky to have, then we're going to give you that alpha right here on the pod, brothers.
I think something to throw into the ring too is even in bigger companies where you do have experienced people, there's a huge difference between if you have your finance or accounting team is like really seasoned with inventory management. Inventory management from an accounting perspective is totally different from like functionally how to do that and then have it be useful for you on an ops perspective, right? Like accountants basically care if it ties out at the end of the month, right? And that is not useful to anybody except for the accountant at the end of the month, right? And so there's, even when you do have people that are traditionally trained or educated, so on and so forth, there's just this huge disconnect between what is functionally useful in a business every single day and how they would approach it.
Sure.
Completely.
And I think like I said, to go with that, Oren mentioned sort of like not just seasonality, but sort of trends, right? And so obviously with fashion, and this is one reason I've always been sort of recently, or in many recent years, been turned off by like hospitality and by fashion, right? In terms of like investments, unless they're vanity investments, right? Because so much of it is just like A, subjective, and B, just is ever changing, and you're constantly chasing cool. You are literally just on a mission to constantly chase cool. And in the high end of hospitality and of fashion, the only ones that make money are the real high end, right, are like the cream of the crop. Like you can
But the
be the
margins on
mid-market.
that are absolutely smacking. Like the only thing that would make me look into clothing lines further is like, look, we sell like $400 to $700 jackets and stuff like that. The margins are nuts.
Sure.
And so if you are able to catch the trends and get that right person, have it considerably, and like have the person, luckily there's like a female visionary behind it who's really on what those look like, then like you can murder it. But if you're not capable of doing that, then it's
Then
not a line.
you're screwed. I mean, this is why LVMH this is why Arnaud, whatever, the owner of LVMH, is like the second richest man in the world, right? Well, because if you can be the right or the richest man in Europe, if you can actually be on top of it, you crush.
Yeah, hospitality is a great example too, because once you get one in, you have one cool thing, and you're able to get a second or a third. And we see this a lot in Austin, where like all the people who had gotten one or two of those businesses now have like 10 or 15 or 20, because like once you have that list and those right things, and people believe it as it's a blank business, even if it's a different vertical, then like that's the nice part about that luxury space, is you can move in between things. Like you can have a coffee shop and a restaurant and a blank and another, and like and keep that brand consistent and that experience consistent as long as you deliver.
Well, to go along with this, the last piece about sort of from my perspective that I think becomes interesting to think about is, and obviously this happens with cannabis, right? It happens definitely with food, right? And we saw it happen with skincare when I had a piece of a skincare brand, which is that like, first of all, skincare dries up, right? You have 60,000 lip balms sitting in a warehouse. You don't sell those 60,000 lip balms in a year, just so you're aware. Open a chapstick a year later than it was created. It will be lighter. It will be smaller. It will not be the same, right? I know whether or not we can debate whether cannabis expires. For sure, from a legal perspective, it does, right? Like there has to be some sort of level in which inventory has to be gotten rid of, right? Definitely with food, right? So this becomes a whole nother complexity, which is not just like forecasting in terms of like, if we buy all this today, can we sell it next month, or can we sell it over the next 12 months? If you have a product that's consumable or has some sort of expiration to it, that obviously complicates things as well, even more, because you have to figure out how to move that product in said time frame. Right?
Totally. Yeah, and looking so many things do. So you have the seasonality that comes from cool. You have the things of actual like perishable goods. I think we'll hit one more point on sales forecasting. We should go into manufacturing planning, where I think that's a really good transition. So the last thing I want to hit on the sales forecasting was there's like these concepts. There's like MBA concepts of forecasting as well, which are probably really useful in large businesses. But like if you hear these concepts and you're running a smaller business, you should run away. And one is doing your forecasting with simple linear regression or with multiple linear regression. So simple linear regression goes, hey, you make a forecast and you have one variable, and you basically say my ad spend effectiveness variable is going to impact my forecast, and I'm going to make a model based on that, which sounds all right in concept, but is really probably not going to help you, because anytime you're making some sort of model versus trying to just base it as much as you can on actuals is going to be an issue. Then you have like multiple linear regression tends to get not only this is the kind of thing where people just put a bunch of variables in there to say, hey, we took all this time making a forecast, but just to kind of cover everyone's ass, that it has every single thing that you possibly could in there. And they're going to be like industry trends and, like the weight of the dollar to the ruble and, like our ROI changing on like these platforms, make all these things to say, hey, we're going to spit out this forecast on the other side. And, if those are the kind of stuff where I would just say all that is too much for any but the biggest businesses. And that's the kind of stuff that McKinsey and Gardner and these folks get paid a hell of a lot of money to do, whether it's effective or not. And sometimes it might be, sometimes it isn't. But if you're hearing about those kind of things, or someone's pushing you to do that at a business that is, sub $100 million a year, don't look at it. Would just be my number one kind of recommendation. And then from that, I think we'll transition from the sales forecasting piece of this to the actual manufacturing planning piece of this.
I just want to the other use of linear regression models like that are so that consultants can make forecasts without just clicking and dragging all the formulas to the right. Really, I think you can do a lot of useful stuff in smaller businesses where you're, Oren, you mentioned, conversion rate or effectiveness of an ad spend, right? Like that's something where that be a useful variable to bring in on top of your forecast that is based on reality and based on how you know the business. But in general, these regression models are so that you can, have something besides a really predictable line dragged out without understanding the business that you're forecasting for. And so that is useful for consultants. It's useful for, financial analysts that are internal that aren't actually in touch with the business, right? Because all these things, I think every one of these is going to start by dragging it out to the right? And then you get to come back in and take things like seasonality that isn't always going to be captured in some annual report about your industry, and take all of these things into account to get to a useful forecast, right? And a regression model is a quicker path to that level of nuance that the people using them typically don't have.
Dude, couldn't agree more.
Dude, this is, by the way, this is one, like I said before we even started this pod, one reason this is fun for me is because, like, again, like I'm really a hands-on scrappy dude, but it's amazing to me sort of some of the experiences that you guys have in terms of like your knowledge base. It's nutty because like that's all totally new to me, to be completely straightforward with you.
I also just take any opportunity possible to bash on consultants. So
fair enough.
Yeah, look,
consultant bashing pod
we
sponsored by
understand,
McKinsey.
When McKinsey comes to buy Builders Build, and there's gonna be a provision where they're like, hey, we're purchasing it, but this Colin Manforce guy,
Colin's got to go.
He's
finally.
Look, he's gonna get an exit package. It's gonna be respectable. But we get it.
And Oren, I'll be stuck there for the next 10 years.
I'll show up. Look, depending on how big that check is, I'll be out there in the full Brioni. You know what I mean? Just rolling up the table. Yo, you want that in the PowerPoint? Let's go.
All right, let's move on. Manufacturing planning.
Manufacturing planning. So I'll hit on three kind of for four key concepts real quick, and then we can kind of dive in. So if you're doing manufacturing planning, there's the idea of scheduling and master scheduling, material planning, which is like all of your parts and the things you have to use to make your stuff, capacity planning, which is how much you can make within your schedule. And the last is second thing we'll talk a bit about is efficiency, and just in terms of how do you track how well you make the stuff that you make. I'm going to turn a lot of this over to Colin because he has been in charge of the manufacturing operation of the company that we were running together. And, there's a lot to dig into.
Man, so broad strokes, like I touched on immediately, right? So after sales, you have your inventory need, your current inventory level, and then the delta between that and the projection, right? And so the way that we do it right off the bat, you have, okay, here is my inventory need that I do not currently have. And from there, you can back into all of these things, right? So coming back to why you should have as few SKUs as possible, as you can imagine, this gets exponentially simpler the less SKUs that you have. So in the case of what we do, right, I think it's like 25 to 30 product lines, which all have between 2 and 5 components to them, right? So when I say now going from inventory in stock to the delta and beyond, we have to do that at the component level on every single one of these things, right? Whether it is a raw material that goes into your product or a label or a packaging component or the other packaging component, not the one packaging component, so on and so forth. So it gets very, very sticky very quickly. And something that I wanted to hit on right out of the gate, I know we're going to talk a little bit later about software and whatnot, but most of these processes, I think, until you get really big, are best served in spreadsheets, or some rendition of a spreadsheet, right? Like I'm obviously a big fan of Coda, which for all intents and purposes is a spreadsheet that's made much more useful. But all these things are interconnected, right? You go from that need, the demand that you have, you back into what you need to for that, and then you inform your schedule from there, right? So again, that schedule is all contingent on the actual product lines that you need to create. And it's exactly why you should not do t-shirts and you should do one size fits all snapback hats instead for your shitty clothing brand. Sorry.
Well, hold on. I want to say really quickly, because this is, I think, an opportunity, just something clicked for me. First of all, there's a term Colin said that we've never clarified, and anyone could Google, but I'm sure many are not. That's just delta. And delta's just change, right? And I think the other thing that made me realize we say alpha all the time, and I'm not sure we've ever defined alpha, but like alpha is a gain, right? Like alpha is like the outperformance over the benchmark. The outperformance.
Wait, I thought alpha meant being like big and tall and handsome.
Oh, the alpha means, well, in our perspective, big, tall, handsome, yoked.
I thought that's what. I thought every time Oren was like, "You're here for the alpha," I thought that's what he was saying.
You're here for us. You're here for the snacks. You know,
for the snacks. We could do a whole pod on the Greek alphabet. Actually, we should break down all of them.
What episode is Chad Pod? Where we just
Chad Pod. You gotta get Solbra on. How do you get Chad taller? Pod for sure? Yeah. Dude, how do you get taller? Not to go tab talky, but I read an article the other day about that dude who was in space. and gain 2 inches from being in space for 10 years. That's how you get taller. Is you go
Relieve the
sans
pressure
gravity.
on your-
You go sans gravity for
float tanks, brothers. All my short kings out there, float tanking definitely. You know what I'm saying? Just 10 years of float tanking, and all right, I'm sorry.
It's that simple. Sorry, that was my little addition because I know nothing about this stuff, right? So that was my little addition to it.
But I think that, you know, we probably shouldn't get too much into a lot of detail here because it varies so much, right? I think the big deal here is is the source of your inventory placing a PO with a manufacturer, in which case your life is much simpler and you basically just need to be thinking about lead times on that. Or if you're assembling or making something in-house, in which case it all goes to hell. No, just kidding. In which case it's much more complex because then all of a sudden, instead of going, you know, one PO for one thing, my life is good. For one SKU, you don't have to worry about all the component level or input level things that you need to have in hand. Oren, were you going to say something?
No. Good.
Oh, I misread your. Sorry. Oren was holding up a flag, waving, and I thought he was going to chime in with something valuable. I don't know.
I was just like, nah, bro. Like, I think you're on a great track. I just want to say, hey, I think you're a king. You're doing great on this. Just keep dropping that alpha for the brothers.
I'm trying to bring that alpha. Yeah, exactly. Right.
Bring it in.
I was gonna say.
We can't just say sorry, interlude. We can't just say brothers anymore because we have reached 7% female listenership, and so I would say that it is brothers and sisters from now on. Yeah,
officially.
From now on.
Yeah. Something that just related to if you are doing manufacturing and really like bigger than manufacturing, assembly, right? So I think this even applies to if you're doing your own fulfillment. And I don't know why I always have a bias that we're talking about e-commerce businesses, but if you are doing your own fulfillment, and this is something I've looked at with my wife on her business because she has not outsourced fulfillment yet, right? You know, we probably shouldn't dive into like how you're designing your manufacturing line or your assembly line, even if it's something as simple as like getting a package out the door. But efficiency trackers and tracking that all day, assuming you're in a position where you have somebody doing this for a few hours or for all day. I've seen a lot of like really overcomplicated mechanisms for tracking that. There's a lot of like really expensive machines you can do to, where it's like it's sensing the movements on your line so that you can tell if it's deviating from its standard efficiency, blah, 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 blah. You can also just do really, really simple trackers. And so what we've done for our operations is at the most basic level, you can just capture it hourly. Give me what we did in the last hour. Where's that put us compared to our goal, and having that displayed on a screen so that everyone involved understands where we're at. Again, this is for assembly manufacturing, but it also could be for, hey, we need to ship 1,000 orders today. Here's where we stand on those 1,000.